you and I are trying to do the best we can, yet we're still half addicted to all sorts of luxuries that are versions of Trump's greed. We're all being forced to look at what's happening and to pretend that it's not us, when actually it is us. Until we fully get that message, we're probably just going to keep getting slammed on the head by it. I mean, having a mystical perspective for me means that I believe that what's happening on the exterior is very much like a mirror or projecting what's happening on the interior. We're in this process of disintegration, accelerated meltdown, what were stable aspects of our planetary support system. And that's expressing something within us that has to die and change and be reborn.
For episode 37, my guest is Daniel Pinchbeck, who is an author, speaker, and thinker. He wrote the book 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which predicted the shifts of 2012 and the ending of the Mayan calendar. He wrote his personal story of discovery, Breaking Open the Head, one of the first books to document Burning Man and shamanic plant medicine experiences, and the more recent How Soon Is Now, which is a book of solutions to the issues that we face as humanity today. I interviewed Daniel, who I've known for a few years, in New York in the spring, whilst he was having an existential crisis that we joke about in the conversation. He is now out of that and recently wrote these words. It was a bit long to read, so I've taken the start and the end. It serves as a meaningful introduction to Daniel and his work and this interview. He wrote, I woke up remembering that our role in this lifetime is to be part of the dimensional shift to another level of reality. I forget that sometimes as I get fixated by the spectacle of the destruction of the biosphere, overwhelmed with this deep desire to stop it, to make my being into a single-minded outcry of anguish against it. Since reading the IPCC report, I've been unable to shake off a feeling of sorrow and personal responsibility. It is only by remembering what many shamanic journeys unerringly revealed, the world is a dream, we are dreaming as it dreams us, that I can come back to this beautiful center to let go of grief and failure. At the same time, I renew my commitment to find the way through the labyrinth. The story wouldn't be as great as it is. We wouldn't have bothered to write it together if it wasn't a nail-biter and the ongoing unfolding of a mystery. I welcome the surprise or the shock of whatever is to come, whether the phoenix rises from the ashes in some way we cannot yet imagine, or whether we live through some artfully constructed hell. My deepest intuition tells me the phoenix will rise, even though all the evidence suggests the opposite. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I'm delighted today to be joined by Daniel Pinchbeck, writer, speaker, and general troublemaker. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start with a big question, of course, where else to start, which is to ask you to give us an overview, in your opinion, of where we are right now, politically, socially, environmentally.
That's definitely a big question.
Yeah, sorry.
According to, it depends on how seriously you want to take it. I mean, a lot of climate scientists and ecologists are saying that we really overshot ecological limits, and next 10 years theoretically would be crucial, and we should be on a path to radically reducing CO2 emissions, which we're obviously not doing. Some reputable scientists would say 8 to 10% annual CO2 reductions per year would be necessary to avert like a disruptive amount of climate change. And I don't know how it's been in England, but I think it's pretty obvious that we've changed already the balance of the homeostatic balance of what used to be our climate is kind of out the window at this point. I mean, we've had like very warm days. The birds who normally used to come in May, then came in April, then came in March, are now coming in February to nest on my windowsill and have kids, which suggests that they think it's spring earlier and earlier. So yeah, we have anecdotal evidence, we have scientific evidence, and then we have the fact that a lot of evidence is being just ignored or avoided. Yeah, a lot of the destruction is still going on or even increasing. So like, the tropical forests produce 20% of our oxygen. We're seeing massive deforestation in the Amazon, and then as temperatures rise, that's also leading to bigger and bigger forest fires, which obviously turn like carbon sinks into releasing CO2. I know, so it's like that's all happening, and depending on how pessimistic you are or optimistic, you could say, well, we don't really know, and maybe it'll be fine, or you could say that we really are like creating the conditions for our own potential extinction. And that could happen sooner than we would imagine, because in past epochs of climate change, there have been like these radical disruptive breaks that they found in the climate cycle when all these feedback loops get engaged. But maybe that's not happening. It's possible that something else is happening. I don't know. And it's also possible that, and that's what I wrote a book about, How Soon Is Now, thinking about what would be the way that people would rally to deal with the situation. But it really would require such a radical shift of focus and consciousness that it doesn't really seem like that's happening anytime soon. We could shift to a regenerative farming model, create a huge global movement to get people to stop eating meat. We know we're going to rapidly shift to renewable energies in 10 years, reforest, even use technologies for reforestation. I mean, there are more and more solutions that are really fascinating in every area. So I guess the question would be whether we're going to rally to apply them, but we only have a limited amount of time, because as the climate gets warmer and crazier, it's going to be harder to interrupt these catastrophic cycles. Also, there is still the phenomenon of peak oil, and eventually energy will become more expensive, so it'll be harder in that sense. So yeah, so it's we're in this interesting juncture where we're still sort of, most of us who are middle class or upper middle class can sort of continue business as usual, but we can also see that all these things are like changing at different levels. And on a political level, there's been a kind of retraction back into kind of neo-authoritarianism. And that's, I think, because a lot of people who are particularly older people, working class people, are intuitively terrified by the level of chaos and uncertainty. So they're regressing back into just wanting like strong leaders, or they're so numb that they just want to be entertained. I think one of the main factors going for Trump in the U.S. is that he's just like an ongoing entertainment spectacle, like a reality TV show, and people are just used now to being communicated with in the form of like spectacle and entertainment. So they just look for somebody who kind of like reinforces that.
So it's made the White House kind of in the news just more like some of the other shows that are on.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like an ongoing entertainment spectacle.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody really cares about the content, which is interesting. I guess the hopeful possibility would be there's some type of disruptive break, like for instance, since they're deregulating the financial system again, maybe we would see something like 2008 when there was a financial breakdown. But maybe if that happens the next few years, there'll be like a whole new set of tools, potentially blockchain, which is developed over the last 10 years. It's like Bitcoin was like blockchain 1.0. Using mathematical algorithms to create a medium of exchange that has a limited finite supply, kind of like gold. So it's like digital gold, but unfortunately we've learned tons of computing power, so it's actually adding to the environmental burden. Then we have Ethereum, which is like 2.0, which is like a blockchain operating system where you can put smart contracts into the blocks. People will be able to always, agree that they're going to follow these certain codes or ethoses or whatever. And so that's now allowing for all these new companies to form. But now we've learned that Ethereum has some inherent problems, like it's not really scalable. So they're having to, like, in the midst of having put like tens of billions of dollars into all these companies, they're trying to figure out what to do, because I don't think it's actually working that effectively yet. Maybe 5 to 10 years, some people think, or it might be sooner, until we see the blockchain being as usable as Facebook or something is. Like, it actually took a long time with the first wave of the internet, but the promise would be the big democratization of finance in the same way that the first wave of the internet has influenced communications, so that now everybody like yourself can reach out to an audience and have a blog, or, and the way the main media companies were kind of disrupted, although now they're kind of reconfigured. That type of stuff will be happening for finance and also for governance, because actually every cryptocurrency or whatever they're called is actually in a way like a different social philosophy that's like embedded in code. So it's a decision-making system. And so that's quite interesting, because we might see like different decision-making systems develop that are more decentralized or more truly democratic. So yeah, that's one of the hopes of the situation.
I'd like to come back to the solutions that you give in How Soon Is Now and kind of look at those. But whilst we're talking about blockchain and Bitcoin, can you share in a little bit more detail like where the opportunity in these systems lies?
In what sense? I mean, there's obviously commercial opportunity. I mean, because of the way they function, they can disintermediate. So it actually can remove a lot of mid-level jobs, like service people in the banking industry or financial services. So for instance, like Imogen Heap is a musical artist who's creating a blockchain-based system called Mycelium, which is like a music sharing system that, when it finally works properly, will disintermediate. So any money that people put into that system will go directly back to the musicians or the producers. So it'll take out the middlemen, the managers, the record company executives, and so on. So there's that promise that it could disrupt industries by disintermediating. That's not necessarily going to be great social progress. I mean, maybe a little bit. More interesting is that it could allow for like a truly decentralized like voting system where everybody has a provable digital identity. So you could create, like, there's a group called democracy.earth, which is building a platform called Sovereign. And it's like a liquid democracy platform. So now we vote for a representative from two parties. And every 4 or 6 years, we have the opportunity to maybe vote in a different representative. With a liquid democracy system, we could vote continuously. We could look at all these different areas. So we could say, okay, I'm not an expert on energy, but my friend Fred knows a lot about it. So I'm going to proxy my vote to Fred. And Fred will be like, oh, something about energy, but actually Frida knows way more than me. So I'm going to take all these votes that have been proxies being given to Frida. But then if you realize a few months later that Frida is actually taking kickbacks from Exxon or whatever, or you don't have to wait a year or 6 months or even a day, you take your vote back right away and give it to somebody else. So that could allow for a truly democratic system, which we've actually never really had before. What we have now is more like a representational system that has like limited democratic potential. But it would also require, look out for the danger of kind of mob rule, like democratic mobs don't necessarily vote in the best interests of the planet or themselves, because they don't necessarily have all of the right information they would need, or the education or the reasoning capacity. So you would have to integrate a platform like that with some way that people would learn, be schooled in how to reason more, to take more responsibility for their decisions. So it's a lot of things to deal with. Similarly, you could create a universal basic income using the blockchain. So some way that some form of resource gets distributed automatically every month to everybody who's in the system. So anyway, it opens for a lot of different efforts to try new things that could be more truly egalitarian or truly democratic. Whether those technologies were given the chance to scale up, because if you remember back in Internet 1.0, there was all this utopian promise. Everyone was like, oh, it's going to democratize and help humanity. And then ultimately, the corporate interests and new corporate interests figured out how to game the system, essentially kind of subvert everybody's attention and profit from their data.
And did we see that coming? Did we know that was what was going to happen with Internet 1.0?
There were concerns, but I think the way it's gone, like we're really now seeing the shadow side of the whole thing. There's many problems, but one problem is that because we don't have like a secure holder of our own identity, companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon basically control our data for us, and then they choose how to manipulate us in terms of what they show to us or share with us, or how they can sell that data to other entities like advertisers and corporations or political parties. So it's turned out to be a really very problematic system.
The blockchain cryptocurrency class, as you like, is a very particular kind of person at the moment. So it's somebody that's maybe exposed to the tech world, or that's really into social enterprise, generally middle class people. Does this technology have the power to actually really go out and reach the masses and really create a place of equality?
Well, I mean, inherently it has that capability. I mean, Facebook is now used by 2 billion people a day. I mean, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, people didn't need, I mean, nobody, most people who use Facebook have no idea how to code HTML or whatever. So it's kind of a similar thing. Ultimately, the technical side of the blockchain will become invisible, and there'll be interfaces that'll just be like, oh, like, not only can I connect with these people, but I can also vote with them or build power with them, which in theory, actually, Facebook could allow you to do that right now, but they don't because there's no economic incentive. There's no reason you couldn't have I mean, I started Evolver. We have a 3.5 million person group. If we could connect all those people and be like, hey, everybody who loves these Evolver ideas, do you all want to boycott plastic bags together, or do something against Monsanto, or encourage Apple to not make all of their products so that they have to be trashed every 6 months, and the cords don't work in the new products. You have to buy new cords all the time, which is just totally creating more and more plastic waste, which is killing the environment. Would you like to do that? I'm sure 3.4 of those million of those people would be like, yeah, let's all do that together, but we don't have that capacity. So Facebook in a way shows us the potential that what we could have with people power, but then thwarts us from having that power in order to increase its profit margin.
How is that different from something like a Vaz or some of these platforms where we all come together and put our name to a petition or to a
petitions
movement?
Really don't seem to do very much. I mean, you can sign petitions from now until doomsday. I think the only thing that really would be effective would be for people to take collective action together. What if we had like a climate march where 1 million people went to Washington? They didn't just like march for the day and then left. They marched for the day and then they sat in the streets, until they got arrested. Like at a certain point, the prison system can't hold more than a few 100,000 people. So if you had millions of people rising up, that's really when it becomes very challenging to the government. It becomes very like unmanageable.
Right. And so if millions of people went vegan on the same day for a month, that would actually be felt by the system if they were all able to coordinate that.
That's that would be felt, but that's not really challenging. I mean, that's great and it would be good for the planet, but maybe there are other things even more active that we would have to do to change the direction of things. I mean, we're seeing in the U.S. right now this an interesting evolution of social movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Me Too, or now the one that around gun control started by the kids in Florida. So that's an interesting trajectory. It could be that something, and you can see there's real fear on the part of the power structure around those movements. I mean, particularly with the gun control movement, because that really shows the fundamental irrationality and disregard for children's lives that people who are bought into this sociopathic corporate Republican ideology have adopted.
Mm-hmm. So how do these movements become impactful and really important?
Well, I mean, I think you can't really predict that. There's moments that are overflow moments, like nobody predicted the Berlin Wall was going to be taken down by people in 1989. So subliminally, people had reached some point where they just didn't give a fuck anymore, and they were willing. The first waves of those people were willing to risk their lives, and then it was a moment when the military and the police also capitulated, and we're like, okay, then things change. So we never know when those types of overflow moments might happen, and it could be that that's closer than we think. But particularly in the U.S. now, the ideology seems so fragmented. People are. Are you asking me your first question? I recently read a book that I did find helpful, which was by Ken Wilber. It's called. Have you read his stuff or know him at all?
I know him. I've read a little bit.
Yeah, he's into the spiral dynamics idea that consciousness evolves this kind of spiral, and each evolutionary stage is more encompassing, goes from self-centered to centered in an ethnic identity or a national identity, to finally recognizing your identity with everybody and with the planet as a whole. And so he believes we're in these different spirals, and now we're in what he calls the green. It has become the leading edge of consciousness since the 60s, which is on the one hand Earth-centric, against oppression, pluralistic, individualistic, but the negative pole of that is no longer believing in hierarchies, which is good, but also no longer believing that any position is privileged or there's any objective truth. So deconstruction, which basically says, there's no truth, all truth is totally subjectively constructed, has led to what Wilber talks about as an aperspectival madness, and kind of provided the opening for Trump and his people, because their whole thing is about fake news and bias, and the New York Times is fake news and it's all lies. There's no authority. There's nothing you can look to, in that sense. So that's I think he's got a good point, and that he actually believes that it's up for people who are in that leading edge of that consciousness evolution to take another step forward, because you can't expect that people who are still trapped in like limited ethnocentric or nationalistic identities are going to extend a helping hand. It's only people who have a more encompassing understanding are the ones who would have to build a bridge to those who are still trapped in those more limited identifications. Yeah, I think the book is a short book. It's really useful for thinking about what's happening. Yeah.
So for the average person that's listening, and maybe they have... Who is the average person? I don't know. Just for a person, for a human, a spectacular human that has maybe willfully been ignoring climate change and maybe even the political climate that we're in too, and is listening to this thinking, okay, I want to do something. I want to take part. I want to be a force of some kind of shift in consciousness. Where do they start? What do they do?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had like an amazing answer at the moment. I mean, we were just talking about this downstairs, right? Like, it's not that easy.
We're upstairs now for those people listening.
Upstairs. We were downstairs before, and now we're in your minds. Imagine an elevator going up. People can follow their own. I guess look at what they're skillful at and see how that applies. Yeah, I mean, for some people that might mean building like off-the-grid communities, which I have friends doing that right now. Or it might mean, if you're a lawyer working in social justice, but like I was just reading this article today about this person who went to Standing Rock, which was this big thing in the US where the native people were standing up against the oil companies. And she was writing about how after a few days, she was so embarrassed by the way like all these white people had gone there, like in their Burning Man clothes sometimes and so on. And, the way they were kind of like really not understanding the indigenous culture and kind of constantly trespassing and breaking into their sacred space and so on. They were trying to do the best. They meant well, but often we try to help or intervene, and we don't even have like the self-consciousness that we would need maybe to do that properly. So yeah, it's a difficult situation. I guess one thing would be to aware that there probably is going to be, certainly in the US, I'm not sure about the UK, but another breaking point. I mean, Occupy was a little one, or 2008 was one. And maybe just to be aware that, the stakes are going to be really high because we have such a limited amount of time, to make a shift of direction and sort of be ready to like put your energies in when it becomes apparent there's something worth giving your energy to.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely coming in Britain too. I mean, we still have to figure out this whole Brexit dilemma just as a starting point.
Yeah.
And then if that happens, then suddenly it's an island on its own again. And then what does that mean?
I mean, I see Brexit and Trump very related to climate change, because I think that like one of the main spurs for Brexit was like all the Syrian refugees destabilizing mainstream Europe. And as my understanding, I haven't really studied it in depth, but that what's happening in Syria is partially as a result of droughts and changes in farm tables and so on. So, and within the next 10 to 15 years, it's likely, I mean, now there's more refugees than I think there have ever been, or there's 65 million refugees in the world now. But that's likely to skyrocket as, what's going to happen to Bangladesh? They're 0 to 5 meters above sea level. If oceans rise a little bit, then they don't have any fresh water anymore. India's already building like a wall to keep out the Bangladeshis. Mm-hmm. So where are they going to go? And really, like, who's responsible for that? Well, I mean, the U.S. has been 5% of the Earth's population, using 25% of its resources and fossil fuel energy, and emitting 25% of the CO2. So I mean, it would seem that we were statistically significantly more responsible for what's happening to people like that around the world. But are we going to like level up to that responsibility? What would that even look like? How would you resettle 170 million people, or what would you do with them? I mean, there's just going to be a lot of very intense moral issues coming up quickly. I mean, they already are, but it'll be more like that in the next 10 to 15 years.
But that's the thing, like they are here, like already, these issues. They are intensifying. It seems to keep getting worse, and it seems like policies keep going in a direction that's actually exasperating things rather than opening up space. It does feel like with Trump, with Brexit, there's a lot of like walls being built. And what we're talking about is having the planet needing to be more open.
Yeah, well, I mean, nation states are also very arbitrary, and that was only started in the 18th century, right? Before that, it was like monarchies and tribal cultures and so on. So, I mean, there's no reason the nation state system is going to go on forever. It may be that it's already reaching its limit, and that the future would be more like, scaling up from localities to bioregions to some type of planetary framework, not in like a New World Order way, but, maybe in some type of direct democracy way where resources are sent to where they need to go, and the technologies that are developed are somehow developed through some type of cooperative process. I mean, that would be the idealistic model. But I mean, it also is quite possible that we'll see either some loss of the world's population or like a massive crash of the world's population. I mean, that's happened before too. And then whoever's left after the emergency will reconfigure in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's hard to imagine that willingly we'll move towards something that will prepare us better. And it feels like it's just going to have to get darker and darker until we really are trapped.
Is that what Leonard Cohen went out singing that, right? You want it darker?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but, in so many ways we have, I mean, it's so, as I mentioned, you caught me on a day of ambivalence and existential kind of unknowing. But
for those of you that don't know Daniel very well, on a lot of other days, there's a lot of knowing and clarity in where we're going.
We have more, opportunities in certain respects. We get to fly around the world to do our yoga retreats and, Costa Rica and all that. I mean, we're lucky, depending on what your esoteric tradition is, like the Kali Yuga that we're in is like a great opportunity to find, spiritual enlightenment or realization, partially because everything is revealed and pushed to its limit. So it could be seen as like a great test or opportunity.
I mean, it is crazy. Like, I feel like my life is just such a huge mountain of contradictions that I couldn't even, begin to unpick them. I do like fly around the world teaching yoga, or I'm in New York today. I came here on a plane.
I mean, I guess that's a question, is whether that's part of the problem. We've developed this unhealthy addiction to our ability to have experiences in all these places, and that keeps us maybe from committing to creating like a local utopia, because it's so much, if you're bored of where you are, I'll just go to Bali for a month, or, and every time you fly, it's like 2 to 3 tons of CO2 waste, plus all the plastic and all the crap. So, yeah.
And then on the other side of that, there's a kind of, I guess, a leaning towards creating something that isn't just based on who you are and where you're born, but actually that the sharing of ideas and knowledge and inspiration on a global level is an important part of the solution.
Yeah, I mean, is it the sharing or is it the taking? I mean, like, like people go to indigenous societies, and like my friend sent us pictures from like New Guinea, someplace where he was like with all these natives wearing their penis gourds or something. I mean, it's like made him look good. What a cool guy. He went and traveled with the natives and, met these guys in penis gourds. What's the exchange there? Like, it's really maybe just that he's taking from them. They don't really getting much benefit, from his culture. I don't know. Maybe that would be the revolutionary next move. Would be like this exotic traveling is another, kind of unhealthy addiction to not taking care of, what would it mean to actually create a workable, cooperative utopia where we actually are, rather than feeling that we can keep going to these other places. Mm-hmm. Stuff like that is uncomfortable to consider.
I'm happy to sit in the discomfort. Yeah, I mean, we're sitting here as both as people that have traveled a lot and have had
they've been really powerful. But I think people should. I think everybody should have those experiences. But that's another thing. It's like I know a lot of wealthy people who keep going to have those experiences. Sometimes like, wow, like you're going for your 10th ayahuasca retreat to work on yourself. What if you stopped at 2 and then donated 8 other ayahuasca retreats to like kids in like the inner cities of Detroit, so they could discover who they are. But you have to keep going. We're actually supposed to have respect for you because you keep doing this inner work. But actually, maybe it's just a form of like spiritual materialism that you like have to keep seeking over and over again for something that you really already know.
So what is spiritual materialism? Let's go there.
You know what that is, right?
Well, I know what it is,
From
but
Trungpa?
I just want to unpack it a bit. For our
Yeah, it's
listeners
just like
how do you know if your spiritual quest is materialistic?
I think of it just, most of it is. Like if it becomes about even like developing this great body for my yoga practice, or I got these great crystals, that I really need to have in a certain orientation in my house. Most of it, like beyond like a very minimal threshold, is much more about ego than anything else. It's not, the word spiritual in itself I always find a little problematic because it creates like this duality that indigenous people, I don't think, see between spiritual and material, or spiritual and natural, or whatever, or spiritual and physical. Figuring out how we like take care of our context and help as best we can to shift, towards something more, sustainable or regenerative. That seems like it would be more spiritual, whatever that means, than most things that people are doing. But people don't want to do that because it's uncomfortable. It's like myself also. I'm not saying that I'm any kind of paragon, but it's also, as we were discussing downstairs, it's really hard to figure out where to plug in like properly.
Yeah.
There's not really a structure for that. You just feel like you're making another kind of random choice. Do I like help kids in the Bronx? Do I like teach art to old people? And I guess it doesn't really matter. But then it seems like those are kind of like, anyway, you caught me on a day of existential uncertainty, as I mentioned. So many good things are happening also. And
as long as many good things are happening also. Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you, so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty.
Well, one of the things I'm sort of hopefully involved with right now is I made friends with this blockchain tycoon, Brock Pierce, a really fascinating character who claimed in Forbes that he's going to give away his entire fortune this year. He said he's going to give away...
It was $1 billion.
We said $1 billion, but he's theoretically worth 700 million to $1 billion. So as he was joking, he's like, I may have agreed to give away 130% of what I'm actually worth. But and then he invited all of his friends into a Telegram group. And then he was like, okay, guys, like, I'm not deciding. You guys figure it out. And so in the group, everybody is kind of like, and then he kind of has left. So we don't know if he's serious or like, but I mean, I think that he means it. And so then for me, it's interesting to think about, all right, like actually $1 billion is not very much. Mm-hmm. Like it would cost apparently $23 trillion to make a transition to renewable energy in the next like 10, 20 years. So, but what could you do with it as a leverage? Could you create something in blockchain? They talk about distributed autonomous cooperatives or communities or organizations. Could you create an entity that would take in resources and maybe help people to be able to give their gifts? I'm interested in the idea of using some of the money to create something like almost like a global service cadre or something. So I always meet so many young people who really want to be of service or help, but because of the financial system, the housing market, the student loans, they can't actually do the thing that they would like to do, which would be somehow just to help out. What if you could just offer people a way out of the financial system for a few years. It's like while you're a global service cadre member, we send you someplace, you help people in that area, you retrain them, you bring them the tools they need or whatever, you install solar for them or whatever it is, bioremediation. While you're doing that, instead of getting paid in dollars, your basic subsidy, you're subsidized to survive with healthcare and food and so on. But then you're also getting something like a social trust currency that you can then use in the network for all sorts of stuff, whether it's to go to festivals or people, maybe rich people will say like, yeah, I have this extra house, so I'll make it available for people who have a social trust rating of 5, so anybody then can use the house. So then maybe you could use that as a way to begin to transition people from the money system to something else that would be more like a trust-based system, which I think is like some of the best things that I've seen on the internet. Like couch surfing, I thought was really beautiful because you could go anywhere in the world and stay for free with somebody, and just because you could read each other's profiles, be like, sure, I'd like to have that person in my life for a few days, and I have a couch or whatever. Yeah, once again, I feel that's like the promise of like this communication system is, and Brock's name for this project is One. I think for him is like he had this very interesting trajectory, and then he got into Amazonian medicines and psychedelics and had some, as many people do, kind of experiences of unity consciousness or an awareness of like that we're all kind of like the same. And then he's trying to figure out, how you could use this incredible bequest he's lucky to have to help more people understand that or make use of that insight.
Mm-hmm. And everyone can listen to your podcast, and you've done 2 episodes with Brock recently.
You're on it. Did you
I'm
listen?
on it. No, that would be preparing too much, Daniel.
Brock is fascinating. He actually...
I tried to actually, but my phone...
I believe
No. This is a true story. I'm trying not to replace my phone.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be in this loop of needing a new phone every year. And my phone is revolting against me. So I tried to download those 2 episodes to listen to on the way here.
Yeah.
It didn't happen.
So, Brock actually started a company. He was a child actor, and then he started companies when he was a teenager. When he was 20, he started a company that became a multi-billion-dollar company that employed 400,000 people in China playing games like Warcraft, building up characters and assets and then selling them to Western game players, which is interesting because you can understand from his perspective then the computer internet world is just like this incredible kind of mechanism for creating magic money, like out of nothing in a way. That was a currency that came from just gaming. And then he hired Steve Bannon, who worked under him for 7 years, who's now who just was Trump's chief strategist and head of Breitbart and so on. So he's like an interesting intersection of a lot of different forces right now.
Going back to your book, To How Soon Is Now, and in this book you really very thoughtfully laid out a whole load of solutions to take us into a new level of consciousness and to potentially save us from ourselves in many ways. How do you feel now about the solutions that you've offered, and what it is that stops us from doing the things that we know might have a really positive impact?
Well, what stops us is the inertia of the system, like the financial system and the corporate system and the governance system, working in tandem as like one operating system. So essentially, a lot of things can't really get done unless there's a new operating system, I don't think. For instance, ocean acidification is like one of the worst problems that we face. I do know a bunch of people who believe that this can be solved, a lot of issues can be solved through capitalism, like impact investment. There are actually ways to create, and it is true in some areas, like, renewable energy that can actually be more cost effective now than fossil fuels. So theoretically, there could be higher returns for investors, or at least as high returns as they would in normal stuff. But I think there are a lot of areas where that's not the case. So for instance, like ocean acidification is one of the biggest problems. It's one of the 9 planetary boundaries that the Stockholm Resilience Center explored. And the problem is that the oceans are like these giant lungs that have been absorbing a lot of the excess CO2, as much as like 60% of it, which is one reason it hasn't gotten as warmer as quickly as earlier predictions. But the problem is that the oceans reach a kind of saturation, and then they start to actually emit that CO2. But the other problem is, as they've been taking in that CO2, it's caused the oceans to become think it's like 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. And that's reaching a point where it leads to a breakdown of the coral reefs, which harbor a huge amount of the ocean life diversity. So if we lose ocean life diversity, then we lose the webs of life in the food chains in the ocean, which also is very destructive. And if the oceans get warm and too acidic, then the plankton stop reproducing as effectively. And if the tropical forests produce like 20% of our oxygen, the little plankton in the ocean actually produce 60%. So we want to keep the plankton working on our behalf, right? So the question is, how do you reverse ocean acidification? When I wrote the book, I hadn't heard of any idea of how you could do that, but now it turns out that kelp farming on a massive scale could be a way to do it. But we're talking about some of them estimate scientists estimate 7% of the oceans would have to be turned into gigantic kelp farms. So that's like a huge engineering challenge. But we've been able to do huge engineering challenges over the last 150 years. We've actually re-engineered the whole surface of the planet with roads and skyscrapers and so on. We could undertake something and also kelp is a food. So not only would it leach out the CO2, it's then highly nutritious. It can actually help save populations.
You just need to turn it into a superfood and then have the middle class wanting it in their smoothies.
Yeah,
and we're
exactly.
there.
Well, they do. I had kelp in smoothies. So that's the kind of thing. There are these huge potential projects, or also shifting. Basically, our entire farming system has to go back to regenerative farming practices like biodynamic farming, permaculture, organic, with a much lessening of meat eating. I mean, like cattle, I can't remember if it's like 20% of the Earth's or 25% of the Earth's surface area is like grazing land. So if we radically reduced meat eating, shifted to regenerative farming practices, that would also sequester a huge amount of CO2. And that could happen also. I mean, those things could happen quickly, but somehow we have to find a way to it's like an operating system switch. And I think if it's going to happen, these implementations are going to have to be exponential and scalable. There'll be enough of a critical mass of understanding at a high enough level that, it'll be distributed. Like Zuckerberg and Branson, and someday Rupert Murdoch has to croak and maybe his son takes over and we'll be okay, we can use these networks that have been, kind of hooking people into this distraction machine to give them the tools to engage in this planetary, terraforming process. And we can use the same efficiencies that we've used in capitalism and what we've learned from our engineering practices to re-engineer the planet back into balance. And it's going to be a race against time. Mm-hmm. I feel like I've made you tired.
Yeah,
it's very much stuff to talk about.
Yeah,
It took me 10 years and I failed and tried and failed and to write the book because it's just more than most people want to think about. It was like carrying this huge brick around on my back for a long time.
I think part of the reason it makes me tired is because I don't understand how I can do anything to make that, all the things that you've just said, happen. When I kind of get a bit lit up with energy is when I feel like, oh, okay, I can do something.
Yeah.
And when I feel a bit like, whoa, it's like, well, that feels like it's really out of my hands. Like I have no idea how to make sure that we turn 7% of our oceans into kelp farming. I just don't know how to do it. and so, yeah, I think that's part of the challenge on a personal level.
But I think it is exciting. I think it's important and exciting to realize that there are these possibilities to turn it around, right? Mm-hmm. I met this Google engineer, Tom Chi, who started a company using drones to plant forests. So they can literally plant 1 million trees in a few days or something. Mm-hmm. So stuff like that is going to be available. Or the Stanford engineer, James Ehrlich, created regen villages. So it's like a modular, mass-producible housing unit that is totally self-sufficient. It has composting, renewable energy, other stuff that's good. I can't remember right now. And aquaponics built into it. So those could be mass-produced for refugee communities. Mm-hmm. So it's we actually have all the solutions pretty much. We have enough solutions that we could really get started on the process of scaling them up, creating this kind of transformation. And yeah, I guess at this point you're doing your job by raising consciousness about it, by talking to me.
and then getting tired. And then giving everyone else permission to be a little bit overwhelmed
Exactly.
too.
I know it is, it's a lot to think about.
I really like your way of explaining kind of climate change as a sort of personal initiation and a kind of a collective initiation that we're going through. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's somehow this is like a reflection. Like we're all, as I said, like you and I are trying to do the best we can, yet we're still half addicted to all sorts of luxuries that are versions of Trump's greed. We're all being forced to look at what's happening and and pretend that it's not us when actually it is us. Until we fully get that message, we're probably just going to keep getting slammed on the head by it. I mean, having a mystical perspective for me means that I believe that what's happening on the exterior is very much like a mirror or projection of what's happening on the interior. We're in this process of disintegration, accelerated meltdown, of the what were stable aspects of our planetary support system. And that's expressing something within us that has to die and change and be reborn.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
The
future might not be. That is.
Well, the future. I mean, like every moment is beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful to be alive, and it's always life is precious, and it may be that things aren't so great for the next few decades, or maybe they will be. Maybe we'll make some kind of jump. I mean, there's definitely a lot of really tricky things happening right now, whether it's like AI or like Black Mirror-like technologies that China is already testing on its population and stuff like that. It's a very tricky moment. I mean, but for whatever reason, we're still here. We still have our relative freedom. We're still like being given the opportunity to witness and participate. And that's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
How many more minutes we got?
Yeah, I mean, we're meant to go for like another 10.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I wrote a book called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which looked at this in a more prophetic vein in terms of like indigenous prophecies and so on. And I've checked in more recently with some of the indigenous people. I mean, a lot of people anticipated something, catastrophic or transformative that was going to happen in 2012, and people feel it didn't happen. And that, some people feel it did, but many people then became cynical and dismissive around the prophecies. I mean, in a way, maybe it was a mistake for me to use that year as the title of my book. In the book itself, I never predicted anything, in specific was going to happen. And I do feel we're in a process of transition that is what these prophecies were talking about, and that it has to do with, a psychic evolution, the consciousness evolution. The more that we become aware that the exterior and the interior are mirror projections of each other, the more maybe we realize that everything is psychic and magical in some sense.
What does that mean, to realize that everything is psychic and magical in some sense?
I mean, the whole thing is just like a, magical manifestation. There's like other forces behind the scenes who are playing with this reality. There's like other levels of consciousness. There's like, I mean, I'm a big fan of like Rudolf Steiner's ideas. And he's one of many occult thinkers who talks about, all these different types of subtle beings and other dimensions. But according to some of the indigenous people I've spoken to recently, they say that actually 2012 to 2021 is roughly the transition, from the fourth world to the fifth world. And some of them are actually, like a Mayan daykeeper I spoke to recently, are very optimistic about 2021 being a threshold of a positive shift where like maybe there's a global uprising of the indigenous people, and maybe this nascent awareness of how wrong the system is leads to these transformational possibilities becoming realized, or this new operating system becoming tangible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so my hopeful side says that that's really, I mean, the Aztec guy I actually interviewed here at the assemblage, a Nahuatl shaman, was talking about their whole dream-based philosophy, and he was talking about this idea that we're moving kind of from the son of light. The fifth son was a son of light. The sixth son, is that right? Is a son of darkness. So we're moving from a son of light to a son of darkness. And in the son of light, the characteristics that are most prized for like rationality, reason, clarity, waking clarity. As we move into a son of darkness, it becomes more about the psyche and the dream world and the unconscious. So step by step, things are becoming more dreamlike, and that also means that the psyche has more power. And I actually think that's quite interesting, even with somebody like Trump, who kind of feels like a manifestation of of a dreamlike, trickster. Something about the whole thing that's unfolded feels really beyond the rational mind in a way. Mm-hmm. Even his name, Trump, which is like the trump card in the deck, So that's a whole other angle or vector to think about. And
when are you going to start work on the book 2021?
I don't think there's going to be a book 2021, but
no one's going to read books by 2021.
Nobody reads books now.
I've actually read all 3 of your books.
Oh, wow, all right.
It's quite rare.
Gold star.
Yeah. So you're not going to write the book?
No, maybe. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do next. After I get over my existential ambivalence.
It might be in half an hour. It might be in 5 years. Exactly. Who knows?
Maybe I'll write 2021 and 2022. But no, but I think there's something to that. I feel that like it feels intuitively accurate somehow. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm also, we've discussed a little bit, like, I think the whole Me Too movement is actually also prophetic in terms of the, rising up of the feminine, the fact that women in the modern West now are enough of an equivalence of power that they can begin to, kind of expose all the shadows of the patriarchy. The communication systems also support that kind of instant exposure of all the stuff that was just like clotting up the psyche without even people realizing it. Mm. So that's really, really cool. And
that's a really beautiful way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, I'd heard about like Harvey Weinstein in New York. Everybody knew. It was like this sort of like, emperor's new clothes kind of circumstance.
Yeah, but it's true, like, for all the stories of every woman that has these stories, that without the permission to share them that was created by Me Too, that they do just take up space in the individual but the collective psyche in a way that we don't really know. Like, we couldn't really measure.
Yeah.
As a woman, like, my psyche does feel a lot freer.
Yeah.
Having shared some things, having been in circles with other women, listened, having had lots of incredible and challenging conversations with men around what it's also then brought up in the male psyche.
In How Soon Is Now, I wrote about love and sexuality as like the deepest political issues that society people weren't really able to consciously address yet. And I do think of, like, since so much of it has been about this kind of male acting out, which, for me, it's like, another whole aspect of it is, the kind of monogamy structure that for me is like inheritance of like patriarchy and capitalism. Like Friedrich Engels wrote a book on like private property and marriage and the state and so on, which doesn't mean that some people are not totally happy with monogamous partnerships, but the imposition of it as like the only acceptable form, I think also, has led to a lot of this negative shrapnel and the sort of repression around sexuality that like Freud wrote about, that we repressed sexuality to eroticism to sublimate it, in culture and in science and civilization and warfare and so on. Mm-hmm. So it feels to me that's like another echelon, like beyond the Me Too discussion, is then like, well, what, beyond the sexual liberation, which was kind of a shallow first effort to rebalance something in the 60s, like what's the next echelon of that liberation? Like, what would it mean to have like a liberation of maybe like not just sexuality, but eros, not just in terms of romantic love, but in terms of like how we think about our caring for old people and children and how they get kind of like exiled. Like, I think you were describing a cooperative living scenario where it's all just people in their 20s and 30s. Mm-hmm. And often we're creating in these like urban realities, we're like cutting off the generations. We're just like, exiling people. I mean, it's totally unhealthy. And
we lose so much wisdom of the young and the older. They both have a very unique wisdom.
Yeah.
When you're in those middle years, you're less connected to. You're not connected to. You're kind of out there, busy and da-da-da-da. And when you hang out with kids and they've got their eyes open a bit wider and they're in a place of wonder, or you hang out with older people that have lived an entire life and maybe sitting back a little bit. It is so sad that we've cut that off from our general lifestyles.
Yeah, and that I think points towards maybe like, the more beautiful future that we want to create would be more one where like communities or, where we're more multi-generational, where people had more time. And that's one of the possible benefits of automation. We're almost at the end of the traditional industrial working system. And increasing automation, which is terrifying a lot of people, could actually be the great thing that releases millions of people from having lives of like boring drudgery.
Can you explain?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like for instance, we already have self-driving automobiles. Mm-hmm. What's the largest workforce in the US? It's probably the same in England, is truck drivers. 3.5 million truck drivers. So their jobs are threatened, and in a way that's like why they voted for Trump, out of fear. So that's also why it's not just a question of like reforming, it's like a new operating system. Because it's like, okay, in the future, you won't have to drive those trucks 20 hours a day across the country. But instead, we'll have to create, replenishing local communities where people are, taking care of themselves and their families and the land and growing food again, potentially, but not in like a negative, harsh way, but, with the benefits of everything that we can provide for them through modern society. I think we need to go, make any sense. Like, I think the traditional form of work is going to be, this is like what Oscar Wilde foresaw when he wrote an essay called The Soul of Man Under Socialism that I write about in How Soon Is Now. He said that like we need automation to liberate humanity from drudgery, so that people have the opportunity to cultivate their unique individuality. Because now that's only something that like artists and like creative people get to do. But ultimately we want everybody, it doesn't matter whether they want to be an artist or what they want to do with it, but everybody could have the time to cultivate their unique individuality once they're liberated from drudgery.
And then we really, really could have a beautiful future.
We could, there you go.
We made it. We got to a place of somewhat optimism against all odds.
It's not against odds, but I mean, we are in a tricky situation. Yeah, how we get through the transition is like an interesting thing. But I think, recognizing that that's what's happening is important. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for sharing. And to find out more about Daniel, you go to danielpinchbeck.io.
It's pinchbeck.io or howsoonisnow.info.
And check out the books and the podcast, How Soon Is Now. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?